Thank you very much, Harry. It's a pleasure to be here. Harry's given me a very long introduction, so I won't need to repeat any of that. The topic I want to speak about today is on topology and brutalism, and it's entitled Folded Streets. I'm assuming that through your education here, albeit Western architecture, you have had an introduction to modernism in Western architecture that began with the Industrial Revolution, and that and whether or not you've studied brutalism, it followed on from the period of modernism. Is that loud enough? Can people hear me okay? That's good. So this was the topic of my PhD, which I completed in 2017. And I think it's important, not only I would argue that brutalism has an influence on contemporary architecture, a lot of contemporary architecture, and also it's quite an interesting topic to consider a design process for your work. So I have a small practice in Australia. It was a medium or small to medium size for a while when I was operating in Canberra, maybe 5 or 6 staff. We tended to focus on more interesting projects. Because I was teaching at the university, it allowed me to be fairly selective in that work. I studied at the University of Sydney and completed a PhD there in 2017. I'm going to briefly talk about my practice because there's a lot of content to go through in the brutalist discussion. I won't dwell on that and I won't give an explication of that work, but rather just to let you see the work that I've produced and where I come from. So this was actually my first project, was a farmhouse. Can we dim the lights a little? Is that possible? Thank you. This was the first project in rural Australia, which is inland, hot, dry climate, albeit it's quite green there. A passive solar building that extended east-west across the landscape and had a steel frame that projected off that to create shade in summer and admit winter sun deep into the building where the thermal mass was. I won a competition for an Indigenous Australian memorial in the centre of Canberra called Reconciliation Place. It was a landscape project. My design featured a central mound and a landscape of sculptures that I called slivers that formed a mosaic across the landscape, extending probably 800 metres, so quite a massive scale. And it was designed to be a work that evolved over time as different artists would contribute to that composition. I won a competition the following year for, this time in the heart of Canberra, in the Civic Centre. Unfortunately, this project was never realised because of a change of government. But the idea here was to stitch together a divided part of the city with a public space, with a glass atrium hovering over that square to allow activities and events to occur, with a cafe and a museum also. A ski lodge for a family in the high country. Australia doesn't get much snow, but it gets a little bit. A beach house on a headland overlooking treetops to the Pacific Ocean. I call this the vector house. It was technically, it's the Taylor house, but a fuselage form that rises and folds over the living plane and creates a seamless connection. This was a prototype housing for hybrid housing, trying to reinvent or reinterpret the courtyard house in a contemporary form. So this was hybrid, commercial at ground level, residential at the upper levels, with suspended mass at each end, defining an interior courtyard to the building. I'm going to talk briefly about the process because in some ways that feeds into the discussion on brutalism. I'm going to talk about my process of what I've distilled as an important part of my process. And that came about largely through teaching, because teaching in some ways is an excellent forum for not only communicating a design process to students, but critiquing and understanding what are the key elements to that process. And this is not the entire discussion by any means, but I'll talk about 3 key factors that I think are important and that I would actually instruct students over the first few weeks of any design project, regardless of the project, regardless of the ideology or that they wanted to pursue or their particular style. And the first thing is to recognize is that design is a critical thinking process. It has to be. In the end, we are proposing and putting forward a design that we have to be arguing is superior to other designs in terms of merit. So the starting point for that process has to be identifying what alternatives exist. Too often I had students coming in with a single design concept and having not explored options that they could then consider. So critical thinking, in doing that, I would press them then to come up with at least 3, preferably 5 valid options, not token options, that would satisfy the brief for the project, and to then critique each one of those. And in so doing, we then understand more about the project through understanding the relative merits and failings of each concept. The second thing I describe is finding limits. With any given concept that we have for a project, there are extents that we can press that thing to. We can radicalize those concepts until a point of failure. And that's a useful thing to find. We need to decide and test and experiment how far that concept can be extended in one direction and how far it can be minimized or projected in the other direction. At those points, we find the concept then fails. The form will fail. It will fail in terms of the project. But at least then we've gained knowledge about where that concept lies in the field. It is critical, in my opinion, to abandon the idea of design as a linear process. And too often that gets reinforced. We have a client, we get a brief, we translate that into a design, we then get design approval, then we have construction, as though it's a steady line of development. And this notion is largely supported by the idea of the architect as the author, as though we conceive something in our mind and that the process of design is simply the translation of that idea into form. It doesn't work that way. The design process is a forum for finding out what the problem is. And in so doing, we create forms and they complete our idea and allow us to interrogate our idea. And in so doing, understand more about the project and in fact, question the project. Those things may be different technologies, different sites, and even accidents during the design process invite questions about what the project is. So it's more of a cyclical process. And I think early on in a design process, you've got to recognize that, produce designs and ask them, what does that form mean for the project? Form, ideas shape form and form reshapes ideas. Correct ugliness. So this is an interesting term. In my experience, we often have we are working on a project and there is a solution or a logic that appears for that project, but we resist it, we deny it because we have a preconception about an aesthetic, about a form, about a preconception of what that building should be. But we can't invalidate the logic. The logic keeps coming up and we're resisting that change. To me, architecture and the process of design is as much about letting go of ideas as it is manifesting our intent into a project. And so when we have that solution, it pays, in my view, to accept that logic, that validity to the project, set aside the preconceptions. And if it will appear ugly, and you've got to see that as an asset, because if it appears ugly to us, all it means is that we have not experienced it before. We don't understand the beauty of that concept. And any concept, if it has a validity, can be made beautiful. So set aside the idea of beauty early on in the project. Look for logic, and beauty will evolve from that logic because it has the potential. So this follows on now to brutalism, because in some ways brutalism followed that kind of logic for the design process. Brutalism was a period that followed on from modernism. Post-war, it was a post-war period of architecture, ostensibly 1950 to 1975, perhaps a bit before, a bit later. It had an epicenter in London and parts of Europe, but it really spread internationally over the course of, 25 years. The starting point to understand brutalism is to understand this term, aformalism. There are many, I see countless labels on buildings that label a building brutalist simply because the building is built out of concrete or it has exposed materials. Those are very superficial definitions of brutalism. To understand brutalism, you've got to understand that it was a reaction and a questioning to all formalistic regimes, all ideas of order and aesthetics and beauty. And where it came from was a reaction to where modernism had progressed to, or rather failed to progress to at that time. By the 1950s, modernism was largely being realised by buildings termed the international style, which were highly geometric, ordered buildings with structural systems that were being repeated. And this was being proposed as a generic style internationally. The brutalists, for a younger band of architects that were emerging at that time, they saw this as an abandonment, even a betrayal of the early ideas of modernism, which were quite avant-garde and posed to take the potential that existed in the Industrial Revolution, the new technologies and materials and systems of construction that enabled architecture at that time, with cohorts like the Bauhaus and dictums like form follows function, using material in its best and most efficient and simplest way. And Corbusier, of course, whose manifesto towards a new architecture proposed 5 points of a new architecture. And the principal one, in my view, being the expression of this domino frame, where a building now supported on piers or palotti, as Corbusier termed them, allowed a free facade for the building, where the facade was no longer load-bearing and was free and could be dislocated from the structure. Whereas prior to that, architecture had really been constrained by structure and enclosure coinciding. Now that was liberated by largely a steel frame technology, or the domino frame, as Corbusier called it. But even Corbusier's work was starting to be seen as a superficialization, a radical composition in no doubt. But the brutalists were looking at this building and saying, okay, we have a building here that's the machine for living in. It's the mass production building, it's the future. But in fact, the aesthetic of this building was produced by rendering of white stucco over masonry. So it was a cosmetic fiction, and this is what the brutalists were reacting to. They were looking for something more authentic, an architecture that was born out of the construction and the actual materials of the time, and accepting those for what they were, and doing the best they could. Now, this wasn't exclusively an architectural movement or polemic. There was a movement in art occurring at the same time, perhaps even preceding brutalism. Un art autre and art informel, abstract expressionism in the US, where artists were deliberately flouting the rules of composition, the ideas of what made a beautiful painting or a beautiful photograph. So we see works here where paint is just strewn about the canvas, and the paint forms a composition as it's found, without the intervention of the author, or rather, at least the limited intervention of the author. And on the right here, we have a Hessian sack on a canvas. So the texture and the materials of the canvas itself is being presented as something worthy of your consideration, and setting aside formalistic ideas of what art should be. One architect in particular, Peter Smithson, and his partner Alison, were very vocal and polemic about this idea, and they actually had an exhibition of their own called The Parallel of Life and Art. And here again, we see a deliberate flouting of the rules of conventional art and photography. We have images of biological transects alongside mechanical things, as though there were similar patterns and languages in those things, and without considering what makes art in that way. On the right is a disassembled typewriter, and starts to read like hieroglyphics. A seminal building in early brutalism was Corbusier's Unité de Habitation. And he came up with the term then béton brut, which is mistakenly understood to be a source of the term brutalism. In fact, the brutalism was termed the new brutalism, and it was a provocative term in reaction to a style, a call to return to 19th century cottage architecture called the New Humanism, that it was go back to a picturesque and romantic version of architecture we're done with modernism. So the brutalists reacted to that and trumped that and said, we're coming up with a new brutalism. But this was significant because if we think of Corbusier's earlier work, the Villa Savoie, 1931, a white stuccoed, the machine for living in. Here Corbusier's leaving the concrete unadorned. So here we can see the actual materials that are constructing this building. And Peter and Alison Smithson, who I mentioned before, had the exhibition. This is one of their first works, a school, the Hunstanton School. And here we can see steel frames exposed. We can see the precast concrete floors, exposed brickwork, welded steel. And on the right here, we can see the bathroom basins with all the plumbing fittings all exposed. So the idea here is that the thing itself, the project itself, has enough content that if it's expressed, we can get a valid and authentic expression of what the architecture actually is, rather than the subjective mind of the author coming in and cloaking that according to a preconceived idea of what form and aesthetics should be. But they didn't stop there, the brutalists. They weren't talking only about materials and construction and expression of those things. They were really questioning the principles of classical geometry and classical order that had existed since Greek times, since Alberti's idea of an ideal architecture. They were looking at suspicion and wanting to go back to ground zero, if you like. And that's a radical thing. So brutalism is not about a different style. It's about undoing all the styles and starting again. So if we undo everything in architecture, what are we left with? You know, parts grouped by proximity. Where brutalists found a concept on which to hang a composition is in the field of topology. Now, topology is essentially circulation in architecture. It's the circulation system through a building. And in the field of topology, the brutalists found a way of creating a relationship between parts, but without adopting or being subordinate to an overall governing regime of composition for the building. Topology began in the 18th century with a mathematician, and it is a field of mathematics in the end, Euler. He visited a city in Europe, Königsberg, and asked the question on the left. It's a city bisected by two rivers. Can we visit each part of the city crossing a bridge only once? And by asking that question, the question had nothing to do with geometry or distance. Instead, a new concept in mathematics, and it's a spatial concept, but as I say, it has no relation to geometry or distance. He found that it wasn't possible to do that, that bridges had to be used twice. And born with that then was a field of topology, of which there are essentially two branches: network topology, which you'll often see in computers and electronics, in serial networks, or buses it's called, and tree networks, which are looking at links and nodes or bridges, and also surface topology, which looks at fields where locations either lie exterior, interior, or at the threshold or the frontier of surfaces. So topology, circulation is a simplification of what topology is. It's how it's realized in a simple terms in architecture. But really, it needs to be thought of as the degree of freedom or the degree of liberty, how we can move without leaping or cutting a surface, how we can move throughout space and connect to another point in space. So here, a donut and a coffee cup are the same topologically. They are both surfaces with one penetration, and that's called homeomorphism. And in particular, that shape is called a torus. But you can see the shape or the morphology does not affect topology, its topological value in any way. So going back now to Corbusier's Unité de Habitation, a significant building for its external concrete and the expression of that construction, but arguably as significant for this, what is termed the scissor configuration around a circulation point. So instead of having a plan in a building where we replicate each floor and the corridor occupies a portion of the plan, here the corridor only occurs every second level in the building. And that might seem like a simple thing, but it's a sizable shift when you think about it, because instead of just being a zone on a floor plate, now it's become an entity in its own right. It's become a conduit that pierces through the mass and the organ, and then space is organized around that. So in this case, they call it the scissor plan. One unit spreads over and extends from facade to facade. The other unit extends under, and both connect to this topological conduit running through the building. The Rue Interior, Corbusier called it. Back to the Smithsons, who in 1952 entered a competition for housing, and typically we think of housing, we have a foyer or a lobby and certain community spaces at ground level, and then we have stacked residences above that. In this case, the Smithsons are proposing streets, multiple street decks at different levels of the building, and that is their sole purpose. They are community or public space occupying levels within the building. Now, these are early beginnings of topology. These are the first traits or interventions of the move towards topology and circulation in architecture. So these are bridges, and then the bridges extended and linked multiple unit blocks as well. Here we can see a Smithson's proposal for a competition in Germany, extending a street deck, or streets in the air, these were called, streets in the air. And here the plaza extended across the orthogonal city grid and did so in a free way, linking entities topologically with a pedestrian plaza suspended above the urban fabric. And this is a building that follows on very much from that concept and is probably one of the most significant brutalist buildings in London. It's called South Bank, and it still exists. And here we can see elevated plazas moving between architectural entities with different functions. Each building assumes its own functional shape, and it's linked by a plastic circulation route running through the building. And you think about this, if we went back to that international style building and we compare this, we've moved now from 1951 to 57, and now we've got buildings like this, which are free form, circulation, linking, juxtaposed, purely functional forms without relationships to each other. And, knowing where the front or back or the entry of that building fades into the background. Now, the London County Council Architects Department was an epicenter of brutalism in the UK. It was an amazing organisation when you think about it. It was the largest architectural organisation in the world. Here's a government council employing architects, planners, engineers, sociologists, all working together, not only to produce developments, but to undertake research in urban design and building design. Now, to evidence the progression of circulation through buildings and the intervention of topology into modernist architecture and its ramifications, we can look at Corb. The Villa Savoye on the left. Now, Corbusier was always a fan of ramps. He said, a staircase separates, a ramp connects. And modernism conceived the idea of the architectural promenade, where we move through space in time and we construct it in our mind like a motion picture or a montage of architectural experience. So that sensibility was always there. In the Villa Savoye, the ramp carves through Corbusier's domino frame. It's like an erosion of the geometric form internally. Then we see later his Mill Owners Association, where the ramp connects the context, the landscape or the street, to the facade of the building. It terminates there, but it's still a significant point of connecting the architecture to landscape. Finally, we end up with the Carpenter Centre, where the street, we've moved from the street in the air now to a street that rises from the terrestrial landscape, twists and bisects the architectural form, and the architectural form gets reorganized around the circulation. So here on the left, the Villa Savoye, with the ramp central to the geometric, the Euclidean geometry of the square. In the Mill Owners Association, connecting from landscape to the building, albeit terminating there. And then the Carpenter Centre, where circulation now dominates the composition and has transformed the composition itself. The composition of architecture, the thing, has become secondary to the circulation. So now I'm going to move on to the High Court of Australia, which was the topic of my PhD, and in a sense is a case study in late brutalist architecture, designed between 1972 and 1975. It occupies the centre of a government area in Canberra. And I have to declare a personal interest here. My uncle, Christopher, designed that. I was young. I was a young child then. Tragically, he died 12 days before they started the construction of the building. He was only 38 years old. He worked at the London County Council Architects Department after graduating from university. He went and worked in London, which was a common thing for graduates to do. And looking at his earlier work and his later work, you can see this brutalist sensibility coming through in his work. Now, that earlier building I showed you, the example of the modernist style, is a building that the firm that he joined, Edwards, Madigan, Tortsillo and Briggs, was producing in 1951. By the mid-1960s, this is a design by Kringas and the chief partner, Colin Madigan, for the Australian National Art Gallery. And look at the transformation there. Essentially, we've moved from the modernist international style into brutalist architecture. We have free-form circulation, surfaces moving through the building, and each component part of the building assuming its logical shape. This is a precedent or an antecedent to the High Court. This is for a government building in Sydney. And what was proposed here was an internal street, but a winding, elevating ramp system within the building. So each ramp connected from the landscape, rose and then spread into the floor plate of the building. And it was described as an extension of landscape. The High Court occupies the centre of the parliamentary zone, which is a symbolic precinct within the government area of Canberra. And it was to sit at the northeast corner of a vast elevated plaza called National Place. And the concept here was a bit like the earlier project, was that the building was going to allow a continuum of the landscape, in this case, the National Place, the pedestrian public plaza, into the building. And then that would seamlessly connect to the component parts. So here we have each courtroom of the building freely expressed, the administration area of the building expressed as a separate entity, and then a ramp system internal to the building. The idea being that, you know, we can talk about the symbolism of a court and justice and things like that, but the brutalist sensibility would say, if we take the component functions and we allow them to be read, and they are well designed, then we have an expression of the building without intervening in that sense. So there you can see the public plaza pressing into the building. It is morphed plastically and then moves into the building. And here we see the component parts, each separated and articulated, clearly read, not only from the inside, but from the outside of the building, and suspended in space, articulated from the landscape itself. In stage two, the there were two stages. This was a national competition. And in the second stage, the composition remained, but a cubic form was overlaid or superimposed over in the entire composition. Now, the tendency for many architects at that time would have been to try and take the component functions and reconcile them or integrate them with that cubic geometry. That did not happen. The cubic frame remained unchanged, and each component part was allowed to violate the boundaries of that cubic frame. And I would argue that this is a significant extension of what Brutalism was doing until that time, because until that time, it was like the first stage, it was a collection, an accretive accumulation of forms in proximity to one another. Now we have a superimposition of possibly what could be seen as the symbolic content of the building, the stable cube, and yet we have the component parts transgressing and violating the stable part of the building. And this is the concept sectionally, where we have the national place, the landscape, which the component masses of the building are separated from the landscape, and the edge of the landscape is then morphed into a ramp system that rises up within the volume or carves its way into the terrain to reach the natural ground. Here's a section then of the what I would call the folded street. So now we've moved from streets in the air, where we had horizontal conduits linking buildings, into a seamless ramp system that's winding up and connecting each component part of a building three-dimensionally in space. Here's a, if you get to Canberra sometime, you must visit the building and definitely go inside the building. Here we can see the pedestrian plaza moving under the courtrooms into the space, a courtroom there hovering quite low, and a ramp system that winds up into this large volume or descends down the other side and is completely continuous. A continuum, it was called, a continuum. And here's my diagram of the topological arrangement of the High Court. You can see there what initiates as a landscape element, a public plaza, then morphs into a ramp system that rises and folds in space, connecting the components or carves into the landscape to descend. And because of this radical organization of form, the plans of the building make very little sense when read as a collection. We have to understand them as a transect of a set of organs, if you like. So here we have the ground level plan where the public plaza moves into the building. We have one courtroom and the ramp system beginning, and then the upper levels of the building, which fold over that landscape, suspend the mass in space three-dimensionally, and the ramp system that winds and connects each component part. And now some photos. What's interesting about this building to me, beyond Brutalism, is also the notion of civic architecture. We have a building here that has a function of being a courthouse, but in some ways that fades into the background, because when we move into this interior space, we get essentially what I would call a civic space in a building, where it has the feeling of being a civic space or a room within a city rather than a room within a building. And there are great buildings around the world that achieve that, where the function of the building, anyone who's been to Istanbul and visited the Hagia Sophia building there would understand what I'm talking about. The space transgresses its function. Here you can see the ramp system rising, and also the descending ramps which carve into the plinth or the physical landscape. The hall, can't remember how tall, I think it's 22 meters, something like that, with a suspended waffle slab. And what's interesting about this building is that it gets used not just for court sittings, but it actually functions as a civic space. It functions as a gathering space. Here you can see also morphology within the building that is, I would argue, expressing the topological sensibility, where forms, geometric forms, are being morphed into new shapes and projections quite freely, which was quite advanced for the time. Here you can see the building being used for a concert. It gets used for weddings. It gets used for other ceremonies, regardless of its function. So now I'm going to move on to a project that I did with some students from the University of Canberra called the Topological City. This was done in conjunction with Tsinghua University. We used their facilities. We stayed there for 2 weeks, and we had an urban design project for a developer in a city called Dongguan. Dongguan is in southeast China. This was our precinct, where fairly conventional high-rise was being proposed. And the starting point for this project was to conceive a three-dimensional city that could provide density. We need density in cities. Why? Because it minimizes travel and energy in travel between the various parts of a building, and it also contains the city and prevents the destruction of agricultural and ecological landscapes. Secondly, we need diversity for the same reason. The whole idea, the modernist idea of zoning of cities, of having industrial, commercial and residential areas has been pretty much made redundant. We need to be able to live and work in this, the same precinct as far as possible. Ecology, as far as possible, cities need to function biologically and as functioning ecosystems. And lastly, all cities, the whole idea of a city, of people living in the same place, is about connectivity and interaction in the city. So these are the traditional forms of a city. We have basically an extrusion of the two-dimensional ground plane, and this is based on pretty much on land ownership. So we move from low rise, which has an immediate interaction with the ground plane, to medium rise and to high rise. The problem with that is that when we go for the density that we need, provided by medium or high rise, we are creating topological dead ends in the city where circulation, where the upper levels of the building either function autonomously or are just relegated to residences alone. So the concept here was to look at building forms or structures that form the topological torus, that moved from the terrestrial landscape up over and reconnected with that landscape. And if we then expand that into a composition, we have a single frame, we then have multiple frames that create intersections, and then the potential through the interrelationship at those points to generate space, public space, or meta squares, as we called them. And in so doing, we maximize or certainly increase the available landscape that can be used either ecologically or as public space. So here's a photo of a giant model we built for the design, where you can see threads or networks that intertwine at different levels in different directions and cross each other, and then form intersections at certain points of different scales. So the idea here was that each thread within the topological city was programmed with its own function, that we had residential circuits that ran through the composition, we had landscape or biological circuits, commercial, civic or public space, and utility functions running through the composition. And it created a hybrid urban network through the intersections and parallel relationships formed. But each network had its own logic. So that was a design-led research project, taking an idea of topology and radicalizing it to investigate potentials in urban form. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the influences of brutalism, because if you think how we moved from the international style, from this orthodox building form, and we ended up with compositions where mass and the components of a building were freely expressed and circulation connecting those. I would argue that OMA's Seattle Library is at its core a brutalist building. We have component masses disposed in space, connected by circulation and activated landscapes in that building, albeit cloaked in a glass veil. The Oslo Opera House by Snoetta, almost entirely a topological building, where the building is entirely one of surfaces and spaces residing in between surfaces. And lastly, 2014, not dissimilar to our topological city, although these building forms are really just stacked elements with horizontal and vertical connections. This building was called the Interlace Building by OMA, and I think this is in Singapore. Thank you.